On May 25, 2020, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd in broad daylight at the intersection in front of a convenience store as people watched. Floyd said he could not breathe while Chauvin kneeled on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Two other officers who helped restrain Floyd did not interfere. Hours later, Minneapolis police sent out a press release titled, "Man Dies After Medical Incident During Police Interaction," omitting officers' use of force. It was only thanks to video taken by bystanders that we know today Floyd was killed at the hands of police. His murder sparked outrage across the country and the world, adding fuel to a pre-existing movement that called for the protection of Black lives as one more was taken. In addition to being historically over-policed, Black people are also most likely to be killed by police in the United States. That's according to data published by Mapping Police Violence. People took to the streets in the aftermath of Floyd's murder, calling for justice and change in both peaceful demonstrations and uprisings that burned buildings and cars, turning cities into reflections of the broken communities within them. Minneapolis was one of those cities. 5 years later, the city continues its process to rebuild the hope and the structures it lost. Ken Erdahl, a reporter at our sister station in Minneapolis, talked to some of the people involved in that process.
Yusra Mohamud with the Lake Street Council says in the immediate aftermath of the devastation, some damaged and displaced businesses were revitalized and rebuilt thanks in part to an influx of support.
We were able to get $12 million in donations from 70,000 donors from all over the world.
But 5 years later, that funding is nearly gone and a lot of work remains.
This has never been done before.
Janice Downing is co-owner of the historic Coliseum building, which somehow withstood the outrage.
And so this is from the smoke and the fire coming up, the sprinklers coming down, and it created this image. And rather than painting over it everywhere, we intentionally kept this wall so that we could actually remember Mr. George Floyd.
Renovating the 85,000 square feet of business and community space here required $28 million, and filling it is still a work in progress.
It'll be a year on Juneteenth.
But she knows how lucky they are, considering that field across the street was once another historic building.
It's still surreal that that fell and this building stood. I can't reconcile that in my brain.
I think about it as an unnatural disaster that we experienced in the neighborhood.
Ingrid Rasmussen, lead pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church.
It really is. It is an unnatural disaster.
And Meena Natarajan, executive director of Pangea World Theater, are still engaged in disaster response.
Almost immediately, we started having meetings outside the church, and we created this organization called Longfellow Rising to actually vision and dream and look at what this neighborhood could look like in the future.
And those meetings continued. We've met pretty much every week since 2020.
And 5 years later, those meetings are now happening inside the Coliseum.
There are no words. I am so grateful to know that people can meet in this space and do planning to build the spaces across the street.
You can find Kent's full story on the city's process to rebuild on our website, 9news.com. And as a journalist who covered the unrest in 2020 and the many stories that have stemmed from it, Kent was kind enough to sit down with me to discuss how the impact of Floyd's murder has shaped journalism, the Minneapolis communities, and even himself in the years since. Kent, thank you so much for joining us today. And you were in Minneapolis when George Floyd was killed 5 years ago, reporting in the midst of the unrest and the years that followed. And I think that telling nuanced stories like this one requires building trust with communities that are directly impacted and perhaps even like unpacking any preconceived notions or implicit biases that might come with our identity. I'm curious to hear what were some things you prioritize when telling this story and those that have stemmed from it. And are there any lessons that have stuck with you, like personally or as a journalist?
Yeah, there have been so many lessons. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, this was quite literally one of those events that we will all be kind of going back to as a reference point as journalists, as community members, anyone who is in this metropolitan area, in this state, really in this country, can remember where they were when this happened. And as all of this was unfolding in the days after the murder of George Floyd, and we saw the unrest lead to riots in some cases, into education in many other cases. It was constantly one of those things as a journalist where you're just trying to listen and learn and see everything as it unfolds, because I think many of us took a step back after George Floyd was killed and did a little bit of personal soul searching, no matter who you were.
Totally. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, like you said, this was such an impactful situation that extended to many different spheres, including, of course, journalism. When it comes to your own reporting, ensuring that, accountability and integrity are things that are prioritized, or in newsrooms as a whole across the country, how do you think that George Floyd's killing impacted the way that newsrooms cover stories that involve police, that involve the use of force, that involve kind of fact-checking information that is relayed to us by law enforcement?
Yeah, and it's a process that we were feeling and experiencing and trying to kind of understand. Even before the killing of George Floyd, we had several uses of force and police custody deaths here in Minnesota. Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Justine Damon, all died in police custody or in use of force incidents, and led to a lot of also some public unrest and really opportunities for us to kind of take a hard look. But then the murder of George Floyd took it to another level, because as we followed the aftermath of that, I think what was so apparent so quickly was how different the police accounting of what happened in the morning after, saying he died of a medical emergency, to then the world seeing that video of what actually happened. It made it as clear as day to the general public and to us as media that what we hear from police is one story, and especially in those first few hours, we need to understand that needs to be talked about transparently, as this is the words coming from police, and people need to understand the context there. We learned a lot as a newsroom, and when we talk about what happened in the days after, there was so much anger being on the ground about that original reporting by police that we echoed, saying that this was a medical emergency for a few hours even, because there's then also just a clear truth that comes right after it, showing what happened. And you better believe that taught us a lot, and it was a tough lesson for us in just understanding how much we have to be transparent about where this information is coming from, and that a police version of events is exactly that, and that we have to do our best to find out and get to what truth is there.
Absolutely. In terms of what the community is saying and feeling, what have you heard from them in the past years? Is there a sense that there's any progress being made or trust being rebuilt with governmental or law enforcement institutions?
It really depends on who you ask. And I think that that's true in so many cases in the aftermath of this killing, is everyone's experiences with police and how they view police and public safety in their community differs. And it doesn't matter if you're that spectrum of how you feel about it can vary based on even within communities.
Is there anything else, Kent, that you think is important to highlight or talk about when it comes to telling stories like this one, or just, the communities that you work with and interact with day to day?
I think the big one is that what I learned personally from this is looking at my perspective as being one perspective, and that I don't share a lot of commonalities with one person or another. We're not always the same. We might live in the same community, but we might see things differently, and that's okay. But as a journalist, it means that I can't depend on one person's perspective to help tell a story. And we all as journalists have a role to play in that conversation, in listening to people, in sharing stories, so that we can try to understand each other a little bit more.
Absolutely. Kent, thank you so much for your time and for your reporting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And in the weeks that followed Floyd's killing, companies and institutions responded to cries for change with the promise of 3 words: diversity, equity, and inclusion. But today, many of the initiatives tied to that commitment to justice no longer exist. Also from Minneapolis, reporter Sammy Salina shows us the rise and fall of DEI.
I can't breathe! During a dark time,
we're tired of it and we need justice.
So much came to light.
It became an opportunity to interrogate why this sense of invisibility remains.
Dr. Yohuru Williams is the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas.
Corporations, other institutions were forced to look at the ways in which the murder of George Floyd was symptomatic of broader systemic exclusion of people of color.
Williams says for some, diversity, equity, and inclusion was seen as a light in all of that darkness.
Target being chief among them, who did some really incredible things. The downside, unfortunately, has been this backlash, this idea that somehow in so doing, those same organizations were discriminating against the white majority.
Our country is going to be based on merit.
But after President Donald Trump signed his executive order saying DEI programs divided Americans by race, DEI! DEI! Organizations, including Target, rolled back on their DEI programs, with advocates telling us it felt like betrayal.
I'm heartbroken. I was one of the small businesses that benefited from the initiatives that Target implemented after George Floyd died.
I reached out to several nonprofits to ask them what DEI means to them. None of them wanted to talk about it, but one Twin Cities nonprofit leader agreed to an anonymous interview.
Speaking out certainly on camera and identifying yourself or your organization is a risk.
We granted anonymity because they said that they're worried millions of dollars in federal funds will be taken away from the underserved people they help.
Families are relying on these resources to survive.
They said some of their money was frozen after that executive order, but it was thawed with stipulations.
They cannot be used to support any sort of illegal DEI. I think pretty much anything that we're doing could be deemed DEI.
But with DEI now in the shadows, conversations are stifled.
But it's easy to be cowardly. That's what worries me. It's easy not to speak up.
Steve Young was the dean of Hamline University School of Law and wrote guidebooks to ethical and social principles for businesses.
This fight over DEI ends up keeping us in the cul-de-sac. Circling, and circling. That's really bad for the country. We need to reframe somehow.
But that won't come if people can't talk about those 3 words: diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We should remember the words of Hubert Humphrey, the Minnesotan, the young mayor of Minneapolis, at the 1948 convention of his party, the Democratic Party. We must walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
Sammy Salina, KARE 11 News.
After Floyd's murder, the Biden administration launched an investigation that found civil rights violations by the city of Minneapolis and its police department, which led to the establishment of a court-enforceable consent decree focused on things like police reform. But this week, the Department of Justice dismissed that agreement and moved to cancel a similar settlement with Louisville that surged after police officers shot and killed Breonna Taylor in a botched raid of her home in 2020. The DOJ is also putting an end to investigations into 6 other police departments that the Biden administration had accused of civil rights violations. In a statement, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey said, quote, "The bottom line is that we are doing it anyway. We will implement every reform in the 169-page consent decree." And President Donald Trump's right-hand man, Elon Musk, announced that he is leaving the Trump administration. Musk posted on X announcing that his role as a special government employee has come to an end. He led the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency, which worked to cut back government spending, leading to major layoffs across the federal government and dismantling of agencies. However, an analysis by CBS found that somehow Trump's federal government ended up spending over $200 billion more in his first 100 days compared to the same time frame in 2024. In addition to that, they found the government under Trump is spending more day-to-day in the last 10 years, with the exception of 2021, which was riddled with COVID-related expenses. And in the Middle East, 4 people were killed and dozens were injured after thousands of starving Palestinians broke through security gates and stormed an aid distribution center in Gaza. Those deaths came a day after a crowd was fired upon while overrunning another new aid distribution site. For 11 weeks, Israel blocked all aid into the enclave, putting its more than 2 million people at risk of famine. The newly established Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is backed by the U.S. and Israel, but experts on humanitarian aid say the rollout was flawed and the failure was inevitable because the help wasn't spaced out, forcing people into a single point where a stampede was likely. Now, meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed that Israeli forces killed the Hamas chief in Gaza. The death of Mohammed Sinwar had been suspected, but not confirmed until Wednesday. This all comes as Israel marked the 600th day of the war with nationwide vigils, ceremonies, and protests, with thousands gathering to call for an end to the fighting. And U.S. federal health officials announced big changes to the COVID vaccine policy. U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced that the COVID shot will no longer be recommended by the CDC for healthy children and pregnant women. Kennedy, a long-known vaccine skeptic, said the move positions the Trump administration one step closer to delivering on his quote-unquote "Make America Healthy Again" agenda. However, he offered no scientific evidence to justify the change. Medical experts say the changes put vulnerable populations at risk. And a woman in Georgia has been kept on life support for 3 months against her family's wishes due to the state's strict anti-abortion laws. Adriana Smith was almost 9 weeks pregnant when she was declared brain dead after a medical emergency. Smith's family says doctors have told them they are not allowed to stop or remove the devices that are keeping her breathing because state law bans abortions after cardiac activity can be detected. The plan is to keep Smith alive until doctors believe the baby can survive outside the womb, when he will be delivered via C-section. Smith's mother told our partners at WXIA in Atlanta that it's a decision no one should be forced into.
And I'm not saying that we would have chose to terminate her pregnancy. What I'm saying is we should have had a choice.
And as we close out National Mental Health Awareness Month, I wanted to have a candid conversation about my own experiences and hear from others about their own mental health journeys. This was an incredibly vulnerable and impactful conversation that I hope helps someone out there realize they're not alone. I'll go first. I was diagnosed with OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, when I was 17 years old. And I spent essentially my entire formative years having this condition and not knowing what it was. And the funny thing is, I was diagnosed with that because of a completely different condition. I was struggling with an eating disorder at the time. And the psychiatrist that I saw for that was like, these are all things that you have dealt with your entire life, and they point to a very specific condition. And to get that diagnosis was it gave me a sense of peace and understanding.
I couldn't agree with you more. So my name is Jordan Chavez, and I am a morning anchor in Denver. I struggle with severe anxiety, and I agree that when you're able to put a name to it, It empowers you. You're able to take a little bit of control back, and you can actually start finding ways to manage it. Now, I think a misunderstanding when it comes to mental health struggles of all kinds is that they're curable. And I think once you learn, they're kind of with you for the rest of your life, and it's about learning to manage it along the way through all kinds of things. That's when more control comes into play there.
I'm Jim Martin. I've had a journey all my life with mental health. My mother, I didn't know. She was taken from me at childbirth. She had catatonic schizophrenia. I was diagnosed, I want to say 5-6 years ago, with bipolar disorder. I'm bipolar 2, and to explain that a little bit, I'm on a roller coaster. As age and as I've tried to deal with it, I can deal with it a lot of days and manage it. And this roller coaster goes from mania through the real lane that everyone else is living life to depression. And just not to get too technical, bipolar 2 versus bipolar 1, I just cycle different. And I'm more in my depressive stage most of the time.
My name is Matias. I got diagnosed with ADHD when I was 12, which is actually very rare for women because usually females will get diagnosed when they're like late adulthood. So thank you to my parents. For me, it really changed everything. Right now, I'm doing a doctorate in clinical psychology. I'll become a psychologist next year. And I was failing 8th grade. I thought I was just lazy. And for me, treatment gave me a start of allowing myself to get to know who I am instead of listening to the advice of other people that wasn't working for me.
Hello, my name is Matias. Great. I'm an artist out of Denver, Colorado. Born and raised in 5 Points. I guess my mental health journey started a while ago, but I didn't know it. You know, I was one of those people who lived under the stigma of kind of ignoring mental health. I grew up in a way where I lost a lot of people, which caused a lot of trauma, a lot of grief, a lot of unresolved stuff like that. I lost 2 of my friends through suicide, and I suffered with the same depression that they did, but didn't really accept that.
I feel like in recent years, more and more people are starting to talk about mental health. There's still a lot of misconceptions. So I'm curious to hear from us, who all have our own different battles with mental health, what some misconceptions are when it comes to mental conditions as a whole or our own condition. So I think when it comes to OCD, people usually label it as someone who is very tidy, a perfectionist. Usually people say, oh, I'm super OCD about this or that, when it really trivializes a condition that can be and has been for me very debilitating.
I have a question for you. You know, in the news, we obviously try to avoid anything that might offend people, but I remember a really offensive phrase for a long time that you heard really commonly here in Colorado, because the weather changes every 15 minutes, is they would say, oh, the weather, it's bipolar here in Colorado. And I feel like that is a really shallow understanding of what bipolar disorder is. And so I think what you're doing in educating really is expanding people's minds to not just thinking you're hot and you're cold. It's so much more than that.
I don't want to save other time, but one of the things that really gets me is when someone says they committed suicide. Well, suicide used to be a crime up until the early 1960s. They died by suicide. It's just a paradigm shift.
When I think about misconceptions, I think about the fact that we simplify mental health diagnoses, and that's how these comments, oh, weather's bipolar, oh, I have a little bit of ADHD because I can't concentrate, oh, I'm a little bit OCD, and it's like, but you're not, right? And I think it's because sometimes we're too afraid to talk about these things because it feels like we have to say it perfectly or we don't say it at all. And I think for me, the misconceptions are about the simplicity, and knowing that ADHD is not just about having difficulty concentrating. It's also about being impulsive. It's also about difficulty regulating your emotions, making decisions, planning, executing. It's about talking to different people. I think there's a lot of harm in simplifying human experiences, and there's a lot of good that we can do by allowing ourselves to be messy. Right?
Absolutely. I think there's such beauty in the mess too. And
totally.
the more we really expose the mess, I do it every morning on live TV. I just think you open up a world for other people to be messy too.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add to your point because I feel like that there definitely is a spectrum of mental health, and that can be a thing with people because people will Google something and they'll be like, oh, well, that doesn't sound like something I have. Then that's what makes it important to seek mental health and to understand yourself and whatnot, because, sometimes it's someone else's, this is not someone else's that, you know what I mean?
What are some things that you do to kind of help you deal with any symptoms that might go along with your condition? I know for me, it's like going on walks, talking to people. If my specific obsession at the time has to do with, I don't know, germs or like cooking, I'll expose myself intentionally to that and be like, see, nothing bad happened. I'm still alive. It's not the end of the world. I'm scared of eggs. I'm gonna make scrambled eggs in the morning, stuff like that. So what are some things that y'all do?
For me, it could be something as simple as cleaning, because I know that that's a trigger for my depression. Like sometimes when I'm looking at my space and I'm like, I don't like where I live now, And then now I have a pessimistic look on like my apartment. Oh, it's nasty out there too. It's like all that. Now it's a, you know, so I found that even something as simple as keeping my space clean. It helps me to keep from.
Totally,
you know,
I agree
falling into
actually.
depression. Yeah,
I put it all under the rubric diligent self-care.
Yes, there you go.
Diligent self-care. And one part of that is I've got to have a routine. You know, I get out of bed. What gets me out of bed in the morning is my running. If I didn't have that, but I made a list of some things here. Reading, I get in the now. I run, but I also walk in the afternoon, so I'm a little compulsive with some of this kinds of, you know, as far as ability to deal with it. Writing, I mentioned. I go to 12-step groups. I'm not as good as before COVID, but I started a couple groups because it's a good way for men in particular. When I went into these groups, I didn't know what a feeling was. You know, I mean, I couldn't name it, you know. And I mean, I asked guys
it's
all,
hard.
you know, it is. And I mean, I think women are a little, I mean, here I am generalizing. But,
no,
but you know,
I felt
but, you know, it's getting out of my own head.
Everything we're kind of describing when you talk about depression, it's ruminating on things in the past. Anxiety, it's about the future. So for me, it's just all about coming back to the present moment, and there are several different ways that you can do that. The easiest thing, the cheapest thing, it's the breath work. I think the amount of times you don't realize what your breathing pattern is, when you have anxiety, chances are you're doing very shallow, quick breathing. So it's the deep breaths, letting that in, breathing that out, kind of bringing yourself back to the moment. And if you have a hard time bringing yourself into the present moment, narrating what you're doing. I'm reaching for my cup, I'm picking up my cup, I'm moving it to my mouth, I'm taking a drink of water, and you're narrating your actions through it so that you are back in the present moment. Meditation is huge for me. I can't do it on my own, so I do guided meditation. There are several apps out there that you can choose from. I personally choose Headspace. That was one of the first ones that was there. The man has a British accent. It's soothing. It's amazing. I love it. And then typically I'll read a chapter of a book that is either a biography of somebody who has a struggle with mental health of some kind and then talking about their success through that all, or something that makes me just feel good about myself and ready to take on the day. But again, the nice thing is there is hope for everybody out there. This is not your end all. You got anxiety? Great, so do we. This is just the beginning of your road of a very successful, long life, hopefully. You've got depression, you've got bipolar disorder, you've got ADHD, whatever it may be. That is no longer a hindrance in the world we live in because we have so many ways to manage it if we talk about it and we share it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I definitely agree. You know, I agree with everything that you said when it comes to meditation. Has changed my life. Yoga, movement, breath work, they've completely changed my life. And I think that if I had to just choose one advice for someone that has ADHD or like a mental health diagnosis, it would be to allow yourself to meet yourself. And to know yourself is to really be authentic and accept the imperfections and the parts of you that maybe are full of like shame and guilt. But the more that you learn who you are, the more you know what works for you and what doesn't.
Well, I thank you all again for taking the time, coming here, being vulnerable. It's not an easy thing. And so I'm very, very thankful. And hopefully, if anyone, even just one person listening to this can identify or take something from our conversation, that'll be enough for me. So I'm really grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. You can watch the full version of this conversation on our website, 9news.com. And every month here at 9 News, we like to highlight one Colorado school that's making a difference. We call it Cool Schools. Well, this month, we're featuring a school that teaches its students to become global citizens. Escuela Valdez Elementary School teaches students English and Spanish from age 3 through 5th grade using a language immersion program. By the time students reach 5th grade, half of their classes are taught in Spanish. Photojournalist Byron Reed asked 5th grader Max Reinerson why it's so important to know 2 different languages.
Porque las oportunidades que puedes tener en nuestra vida con 2 lenguajes es maravilloso.
Aside from cultivating bilingualism, the school is exposing students to international perspectives. With a student body that is 65% Latino and 35% other backgrounds, Principal Jessica Buckley says it's important they have staff that reflects that diversity, hiring educators from places like Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, and Canada. And anyone who makes it to 104 years old likely has a lot of stories to tell. They lived through many historic moments and were maybe even part of a few of them. Our Ann Herbst introduces us to a Fort Collins man who has made a big impact through teaching and innovating, though he'd never be one to brag.
Working on my puzzle.
Lots of times, legends are unassuming.
It's my word hunt.
They've got problems, just like everyone else.
Gets frustrating sometimes when you can't find it.
John Matsushima would never say he's a big deal.
No, I'm just an ordinary person.
But in all John's years,
104,
there are many moments that prove otherwise. His daughter Nancy is happy to be his hype woman.
High school commencement program, 1939.
I was valedictorian.
Nancy knew her dad, who was born in Denver to Japanese immigrants, didn't have it easy.
When I was 6 years old, my father wrote my name, Kiichiro. And so when I showed that piece of paper to the first grade teacher, she says that I would never know how to pronounce it, so she gave me my name, John or Johnny.
Johnny took what he learned on his family's farm in Platteville, grew into Dr. John, and had a career as a professor and researcher in animal science, about 30 of those years at CSU.
Teaching and research go hand in hand.
He created cattle feeding innovations used worldwide.
It's pretty special.
To Nancy, he wasn't some egg rock star.
You know, he was just dad,
A dad who took his 8-year-old to work.
Do you remember when I used to ride along with you to the feedlot to Rigdon?
Dr. John's accomplishments have given the pair a reason to road trip again.
He's kind of been on tour here lately because he's got the book. He's 104, he's on the move.
At a certain point, an interesting life deserves a book.
And they wanted to know more.
And book tour to places like New Raymer.
There's no pressure telling someone's life story when they're 104 and sitting next to you.
Rachel Gable.
There's no pressure, it's fine.
Took Dr. John's story and turned it into a new children's book, Cattle, Corn, and Courage, the story of Dr. John Matsushima.
Now getting to see him come into the classrooms and just light up and tell these stories to these kids is such a great experience.
Rachel describes how he came up with a better way to feed cattle.
But when he figured out how to make it into essentially cornflakes, they gained more weight.
If I enjoy a warm, hot meal for breakfast, maybe cattle would like to have some warm meal.
The book also gets real about discrimination he faced as a Japanese American during World War II.
During the war, Johnny was a student at Colorado A&M College. When Johnny wasn't allowed in the market, his friends brought paper bags of groceries to him. And Johnny kept his head low and worked hard to study and learn.
Dr. John is still learning.
What's your favorite breed of cattle?
And teaching.
They're all good.
Just like he did for so many years at CSU.
His first student went on to be the U.S. Secretary of Ag. So he's had some pretty impactful students come through his classes.
You had a lot of grad student parties and barbecues.
Yes.
Yeah.
They all had a good time.
Yes, they did.
We wondered when they would go home.
10,000 college students later.
The honorary den.
And almost as many awards.
1942. That's too long ago.
John might need Nancy's help to place names and honors.
You have a lot of awards on the wall.
Well, I don't know what they are.
Yeah, just like the rest of us. Superstars have problems. It's how Dr. John solved his. That makes him legendary.
And we're using this week's shoutouts as a way to celebrate a few of the ANHPI folks who are doing great things for our community. The founder of Asian Girls Ignite, Megan Yen, is using her nonprofit to inspire ANHPI girls and gender-expansive youth to envision themselves in a future STEM career. But her mission goes beyond that. Yen says that when she was growing up, she was isolated and bullied because of her identity. So now she wants to bring ANHPI girls together to give them a sense of community and show her students how powerful and deserving of love they are as they are.
I had always envisioned a world where every AA and HPI girl sees that they have power beyond measure and that their dreams are valid, their identities are worthy of celebration. And what makes me excited is that this world is possible because we're creating it right now.
And after growing up in Denver's cultural hub of Little Saigon, business owners like Mimi Luong are working with History Colorado to share their family stories with other Coloradoans. Many of the mom and pop shops in Little Saigon are run by people from Southeast Asia who fled here around the 1980s when conflicts like the Vietnam War were threatening the region. Up until now, not all of their stories have been part of the historical record, but business owners in Little Saigon are working to update history.
I think sharing these stories is very important just so other people can hear the hardship and everything that they went through to get to this point of where they are. It's not just our story, there's so many family members in this whole area. Everyone has a story.
Thanks so much for joining this week's Culture Report. We'll be back to continue the conversation right here on 9 News Plus and 9news.com.